If you sign that contract, your company won't survive the next 6 months. The words sliced through the polished silence of the executive boardroom with the precision of a blade, so unexpected that every conversation stopped in the same heartbeat. 42 pairs of eyes shifted toward the back of the room where a young black maid stood beside a polished catering cart, one hand still resting lightly on a silver coffee pot. The faint aroma of freshly brewed Colombian roast lingered beneath crystal chandeliers, while afternoon sunlight spilled across the 39th floor of Sterling Tower, painting long golden reflections over the massive walnut conference table. Richard Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Dynamics, slowly lifted his eyes from the billion-dollar acquisition agreement lying open before him. His tailored navy suit looked as flawless as the skyline behind him, and the expensive fountain pen balanced between his fingers had been only inches away from the signature line. Around him sat investment bankers from New York, corporate attorneys from Chicago, financial advisors from Boston, and representatives of one of Europe's largest manufacturing groups. Months of negotiations had led to this exact moment. Billions of dollars, thousands of employees, and the future of an entire corporation rested on one signature. Yet everything froze because someone no one had noticed had spoken. Richard studied the woman standing near the service entrance. Her gray housekeeping uniform blended almost perfectly into the marble walls. Her employee badge simply read Maya Brooks. She looked no older than 27, her dark curls neatly tied back, her posture calm despite the weight of dozens of skeptical stares pressing against her. No panic crossed her face. No trembling hands betrayed fear. She simply looked at the contract with quiet certainty, as though she had every reason to be standing there. One attorney cleared his throat. Another executive exchanged an amused glance with the man beside him. Somewhere near the far end of the table, a restrained chuckle escaped before quickly fading into the uneasy silence. Richard finally leaned back in his leather chair, his expression unreadable. "Excuse me," he said, his voice controlled enough to make the room even quieter. "Did you just interrupt a board meeting?" Maya nodded once. "Yes, sir." The answer was respectful but unwavering. Richard's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You're part of housekeeping, aren't you?" "Yes, sir." He allowed himself a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "Then perhaps you should remember why you're here." Several executives relaxed, assuming the uncomfortable interruption had ended. Richard placed both hands on the contract. "You're just a maid," he said evenly. "Leave the legal work to the professionals." A few quiet laughs drifted around the table, careful enough not to sound disrespectful toward their CO, but loud enough for Maya to hear. She absorbed every glance without lowering her eyes. Instead, she looked directly at the open agreement resting beneath Richard's hand. "Sir," she said softly, "page 47, paragraph C, changes more than anyone in this room realizes." Richard's fingers paused. The room fell silent again. Even the distant hum of the climate control system suddenly seemed louder than before. Maya drew one slow breath. "That paragraph transfers every future liability from the seller to Sterling Dynamics. If this acquisition closes exactly as written, your company won't own a victory." She held his gaze without raising her voice. "You'll inherit every lawsuit they already know is coming." Richard's confident expression did not disappear, but for the first time that afternoon, the fountain pen hovering above the signature line never touched the paper. Maya Brooks had learned long ago that the easiest person to ignore was the one carrying a mop. Every morning before sunrise, she entered Sterling Tower through the service entrance behind the loading dock, where delivery trucks replaced luxury sedans and security guards greeted maintenance workers by first name rather than title. By 6 o'clock, she was already polishing marble floors that would soon reflect the polished shoes of executives whose annual bonuses exceeded everything she could earn in a lifetime. She never complained. She greeted every employee with the same quiet smile, remembered the favorite coffee orders of receptionists, and always stayed a few extra minutes to help the older custodians lift heavy supply boxes. Most people barely noticed she existed, and after 3 years inside the building, she had accepted that invisibility often came with the uniform she wore. What no one saw was the worn leather backpack waiting inside her small locker in the basement. Beneath neatly folded work clothes rested thick legal textbooks with faded pages, dozens of notebooks filled with handwritten contract analysis, and stacks of printed corporate filings covered with careful notes in blue ink. Every lunch break, while other employees scrolled through their phones or chatted in the cafeteria, Maya sat alone beside a narrow window overlooking the alley and read legal opinions from federal business courts. She had once dreamed of becoming one of the attorneys whose names appeared beneath those decisions. Years earlier, she had been one of the highest-ranked students in the business law program at North Carolina Central University. Professors expected her to clerk for a major corporate firm after graduation, and classmates often borrowed her notes before final exams because she had a rare gift for finding hidden meaning inside complicated contracts. Then life changed in a single season. Her father passed away unexpectedly after a sudden illness, leaving behind unpaid medical bills that consumed nearly every dollar the family had saved. Only a few months later, her mother, Denise Brooks, suffered severe complications from diabetes that forced her to stop working entirely. Tuition became impossible. Maya withdrew from school only one semester before completing her degree. She promised herself it would be temporary, but temporary slowly became years. She worked mornings cleaning office buildings, evenings at a neighborhood grocery store, and weekends caring for her mother inside their modest two-bedroom apartment on the west side of Charlotte. Yet she never abandoned the education she had fought so hard to earn. Every night after her mother fell asleep, Maya opened another legal textbook at the kitchen table beneath a single warm lamp while the rest of the apartment remained silent. She believed knowledge could disappear only if someone chose to stop learning. Sterling Tower unexpectedly became her classroom. Confidential documents were never hers to keep, and she respected every policy without exception, but abandoned draft copies waiting to be shredded often revealed how experienced attorneys structured negotiations. Public filings, investor reports, and regulatory disclosures became lessons she studied with relentless discipline. She did not memorize words simply to sound intelligent. She searched for patterns, for risks hidden beneath polished language, and for the tiny details that could decide the future of entire companies. No executive riding the private elevator ever imagined that the quiet maid wiping fingerprints from the conference room windows understood the language inside billion-dollar agreements almost as well as the lawyers billing hundreds of dollars every hour. Richard Sterling had built his reputation on one simple belief that he repeated so often it had become part of the company's culture. Emotions belonged at home. Business belonged in the boardroom. At 54 years old, he had transformed a struggling engineering supplier into one of the fastest-growing industrial technology companies in the United States, acquiring competitors with relentless precision and rarely making a decision without running every possible financial projection first. Business magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him fearless. Employees admired his discipline but feared his standards. He expected perfection because he demanded it from himself first. Every morning he arrived before 7 o'clock, reviewed overnight market reports with black coffee in hand, and walked through the executive floor without slowing his pace. He noticed untucked shirts, late arrivals, and unfinished presentations almost instantly, yet rarely noticed the people quietly cleaning the offices before the workday began. To Richard, every role inside the company had a place, and those places were never meant to overlap. Lawyers handled contracts. Executives made decisions. Maintenance staff maintained the building. Crossing those invisible lines felt, in his mind, like inviting disorder into a system built on discipline. That philosophy had served him well for decades, making Sterling Dynamics one of the most respected companies on Wall Street. Yet success carried pressure that even Richard could not fully control. The acquisition agreement resting before him represented the largest deal of his entire career, nearly $1.3 billion in combined assets, manufacturing facilities across 4 states, and access to government contracts that competitors had spent years trying to secure. Analysts had already predicted the merger would reshape the industry. Financial news networks waited outside Sterling Tower, hoping to report the signing before the closing bell. Major shareholders watched the meeting through secure video connections, expecting Richard to deliver another historic victory. Every hour of delay threatened millions of dollars in market value. Every unnecessary question risked shaking investor confidence. Sitting across the conference table was Victor Langford, the polished chief executive of Langford Industrial Systems, accompanied by an impressive legal team whose confidence never seemed to waver. Their attorneys answered every concern with prepared explanations. Their financial advisors presented polished forecasts, and every document appeared to have survived months of careful review. Richard trusted his own legal department, one of the most expensive corporate teams in the country, and he believed they had examined every sentence dozens of times before placing the contract in front of him. His general counsel, Daniel Mercer, had personally assured him that every risk had been accounted for. There was no reason to doubt the process. No reason to imagine that a hidden flaw could remain buried inside nearly 200 pages of legal language. When Maya spoke, Richard did not simply hear an interruption. He heard a challenge to the entire structure of authority he had spent decades building. In his world, expertise came with titles, degrees, corner offices, and expensive suits. It certainly did not arrive pushing a coffee cart across imported marble floors. Around the table, several executives shared the same quiet disbelief. One vice president glanced toward the security manager standing near the entrance. Another slowly closed his notebook, convinced the unexpected interruption would be resolved within seconds. Victor Langford remained perfectly still, but the faint smile touching the corner of his mouth suggested confidence rather than concern, as though he believed nothing a housekeeper could possibly say would alter the outcome of the day. Richard rested his fingertips on the thick stack of documents once more, determined to finish what history expected him to complete, unaware that the certainty guiding his every decision had just encountered the one person in the building who had nothing to gain from remaining silent. Maya did not move from where she stood. The silver coffee pot remained steady in her hand, and although every instinct told her to apologize and leave before she lost the job that paid her mother's medical bills, another voice inside her refused to let silence become part of a mistake that could destroy thousands of lives. She gently placed the coffee pot back onto the catering cart and folded her hands in front of her. The polished marble beneath her shoes reflected both the gray of her housekeeping uniform and the expensive leather shoes surrounding the conference table, a quiet reminder that everyone in the room occupied different worlds even while standing on the same floor. Richard Sterling watched her with growing impatience. His schedule had no room for delays, and the market would close in less than 3 hours. Every passing minute carried enormous financial consequences. "This meeting is over for you," he said calmly. "Thank you for your concern, but my legal department has reviewed every page." Maya nodded respectfully. "I believe they reviewed every page, sir. I do not believe they questioned every sentence." Several attorneys exchanged irritated glances. Daniel Mercer leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his glasses before speaking. "Young lady, these documents have gone through 6 months of legal review by 3 separate firms." Maya looked toward him with complete respect. "I am sure they have. That is why whoever drafted paragraph C expected everyone to trust the process instead of reading the wording one last time." Victor Langford remained silent, but his fingers slowly stopped tapping the conference table. Richard noticed the subtle movement without fully understanding why. Maya continued carefully, choosing every word with precision. "The clause appears to transfer standard warranty obligations. That is what everyone expects to read. But halfway through the paragraph, the language changes from existing liabilities to future liabilities connected to undisclosed regulatory actions. That single change places unlimited responsibility on Sterling Dynamics after the acquisition closes." One executive frowned and quietly reached for a printed copy of the agreement. Another attorney began flipping through the thick stack of pages, searching for the section she had mentioned. Richard remained unconvinced. "You are making an extraordinary claim," Maya answered without hesitation. "Then it deserves an extraordinary verification before anyone signs." The room became still once more. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, clouds drifted slowly across the Charlotte skyline, while sunlight flashed against neighboring glass towers. Inside, the quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed louder than the voices that had filled the room only minutes earlier. Richard glanced at Daniel Mercer. "Have you reviewed paragraph C today?" Daniel hesitated for only a fraction of a second before replying confidently. "Our team reviewed the complete agreement yesterday evening." Maya spoke again, her voice never rising above a calm conversation. "Yesterday evening was before the final revision arrived at 8:23 this morning." Several heads turned immediately toward Daniel. His confident expression faded almost imperceptibly. Richard noticed it. So did Victor Langford. Maya continued. The revision history changed exactly 3 words. 3 words are all it takes to redirect billions of dollars in legal exposure. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered. Even the assistants standing quietly along the wall seemed afraid to breathe too loudly. Richard slowly lowered the fountain pen onto the polished table instead of the signature line. For the first time since the meeting began, certainty no longer filled the room. Suspicion did. The silence finally broke when Daniel Mercer pushed his chair back with a sharp scrape against the polished hardwood floor. His face had lost the relaxed confidence he carried only moments earlier, replaced by visible irritation that spread across the room like a cold draft. "This has gone far enough," he said, looking toward Richard instead of Maya. "With all due respect, we cannot allow someone without legal credentials to derail a transaction of this magnitude." Several executives nodded almost automatically, eager to restore the order that had existed before the unexpected interruption. Richard remained motionless for several seconds before speaking in the measured tone that had earned him a reputation as one of the toughest negotiators in corporate America. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I appreciate your concern, but this meeting cannot continue with unnecessary distractions." Maya lowered her eyes respectfully. "I understand, sir." She reached for the handle of the catering cart, prepared to leave without another word. She had not spoken to embarrass anyone. She had spoken because remaining silent would have betrayed everything she believed about honesty and responsibility. Before she could turn toward the service entrance, one of the younger attorneys allowed himself a quiet laugh that was just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Perhaps tomorrow she can explain constitutional law during breakfast service." A few restrained smiles appeared around the table. Another executive leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Apparently housekeeping now bills by the hour." The comments were not shouted. They did not need to be. Maya heard every word. She simply rested both hands on the cart and remained composed, refusing to let humiliation change the calm expression on her face. Richard finally looked toward the security supervisor standing beside the conference room doors. "Please escort Miss Brooks back to her assigned duties. We have shareholders waiting." The security supervisor, a middle-aged man named Thomas Reed, hesitated for a brief moment before approaching Maya. Unlike many others in the room, Thomas knew her well. He had seen her arrive before sunrise every morning, had watched her help elderly maintenance workers without being asked, and had often found her studying thick law books during quiet lunch breaks. He lowered his voice. "Come on, Maya. Let us go." She offered him a grateful smile. Of course. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. As she slowly guided the catering cart toward the exit, her eyes drifted one final time across the open agreement still lying before Richard Sterling. She stopped only long enough to speak one quiet sentence. "If you decide to verify it, start with the revision log before you read the contract itself. That will explain why the language changed this morning." Then she continued walking. The conference room doors opened softly before closing behind her with little more than a muted click. The hallway outside felt strangely quiet after the tension inside. Warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the marble corridor, and the distant sound of elevators echoed through the executive floor. Maya released a slow breath she had been holding for several minutes. She knew there was a real chance she would be dismissed before the day ended. Losing this job would place her family in an impossible position, yet regret never entered her mind. Inside the boardroom, conversation quickly resumed, but it no longer carried the certainty that had filled the room before she spoke. Richard picked up his fountain pen once more, holding it above the signature line exactly as before. This time, however, his hand remained perfectly still. His eyes shifted almost involuntarily toward page 47, while across the table Victor Langford quietly adjusted his tie for the first time all afternoon, his confident smile fading just enough for Richard to notice. The boardroom no longer sounded like a room preparing to celebrate a historic acquisition. Conversations faded into cautious whispers before disappearing altogether. Richard Sterling slowly lowered himself back into his chair without saying a word. The fountain pen remained untouched beside the signature page, its polished black surface reflecting the warm afternoon lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Outside, the Charlotte skyline glowed beneath drifting clouds, while inside, time itself seemed to move more slowly. Richard reached for the thick stack of papers and turned carefully to page 47. The paper whispered softly beneath his fingertips. Around the table, no one interrupted him. Even the financial analysts who had spent the morning checking stock projections now watched in complete silence. Daniel Mercer attempted to speak once, but Richard lifted one hand without looking up. That simple gesture was enough. No one said another word. Richard read the paragraph once. His expression remained controlled. He read it again, this time tracing each sentence with the tip of his index finger. Then he stopped halfway through the page. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. 3 words. They looked harmless, ordinary, hidden inside language that appeared completely routine. Yet the further he examined the paragraph, the more uncomfortable the wording became. He flipped to the appendix, then back to the revision summary. His breathing slowed. The revision log listed an update submitted at exactly 8:23 that morning. Richard stared at the timestamp for several long seconds. Daniel had told him the legal review had been completed the previous evening. The room remained perfectly still except for the quiet turning of another page. Richard compared both versions side by side. 1 sentence, 3 altered words. The meaning shifted so subtly that even experienced attorneys could have accepted it without hesitation if they trusted the previous draft instead of reading the final language line by line. Sunlight slid farther across the conference table, illuminating the exact paragraph Maya had mentioned before reaching Richard's folded hands. Dust floated almost invisibly through the golden light. Somewhere beyond the conference room walls an elevator bell chimed, distant and ordinary, yet it sounded strangely loud against the heavy silence. Richard leaned back and removed his glasses for the first time that afternoon. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, not from exhaustion, but from something unfamiliar. Doubt. Across the table, Victor Langford remained composed, yet the confidence that had surrounded him throughout the meeting no longer felt effortless. His fingers rested together more tightly than before. One of his attorneys quietly reached for a glass of water without speaking. Daniel Mercer shifted uneasily in his chair, glancing between Richard and the contract, as though hoping someone else would break the silence first. No one did. Richard opened the revision history again. He noticed another detail Maya had never mentioned, a metadata entry identifying the final modification as having been uploaded from an external document management account rather than Sterling Dynamics' internal review system. That detail should have been impossible. His heartbeat remained steady, but the certainty he had carried into the room was quietly dissolving. He slowly closed the contract and rested both palms upon its cover. For several moments, he looked not at the executives surrounding him, but toward the closed conference room doors through which Maya had quietly disappeared. He replayed every word she had spoken. There had been no arrogance, no accusation, no attempt to impress anyone, only calm precision and genuine concern. For the first time in many years, Richard wondered whether the most valuable voice in the building had been the one everyone had been trained not to hear. Richard slowly looked up from the contract, and the confidence that had filled the boardroom only an hour earlier had disappeared without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. He turned one page backward, then another, comparing every revision against the digital summary displayed on the large presentation screen. The silence became almost unbearable. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "Daniel, explain why this revision was uploaded from an external account at 8:23 this morning." Every face turned toward the company's general counsel. Daniel Mercer adjusted his tie before forcing a small smile that looked far less convincing than usual. "It was probably an administrative synchronization error," he replied. "That happens occasionally when outside counsel submits final formatting updates." Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he pressed a button on the conference table. Within seconds, the company's information security director joined the secure video conference from the operations center downstairs. "Can you verify whether this revision came through our internal legal system?" Richard asked. The director studied the file logs on his monitor. The room waited. A few seconds stretched into nearly half a minute before the answer finally came. "No, sir. This document bypassed the internal review server. It was uploaded directly through a temporary external authorization credential that expired immediately afterward." Nobody moved. Richard's eyes shifted slowly toward Victor Langford. The visiting executive maintained a composed expression, but the confidence that had defined his presence all afternoon had vanished. One of Langford's attorneys quietly lowered his gaze toward the polished table. Richard returned his attention to the information security director. Can you recover the previous version? Already comparing both files now, sir. Another long pause followed. Then several highlighted sentences appeared on the large display at the front of the boardroom. 3 words glowed in yellow. Existing had become future. Known had become undisclosed. Limited had become unlimited. The room seemed to lose its air. Every executive immediately understood the legal consequences. Richard did not need anyone to explain them. The altered language would have transferred responsibility for future regulatory claims worth hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially more than the acquisition itself. If the agreement had been signed, Sterling Dynamics would have accepted risks that no responsible buyer would knowingly assume. The information security director continued speaking. There is something else, sir. The external authorization originated through credentials assigned to one of the visiting legal consultants. Every eye turned toward the opposite side of the conference table. Victor Langford's lead. Attorney slowly closed his notebook without saying a word. Richard leaned back, his expression unreadable. Cancel the signing, he said calmly. Immediately. No one objected. Not a single voice challenged the decision. Richard then looked toward Daniel Mercer. Why was this change never disclosed? Daniel opened his mouth, but no explanation came. His silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Richard stood and walked to the conference room windows overlooking the city below. Thousands of people moved through the streets without knowing how close an entire corporation had come to disaster because everyone in the room had trusted titles more than truth. After several quiet moments, he turned back toward the table. The only person who protected this company today was not sitting at this table. His eyes settled on the empty doorway where Maya had disappeared. She was carrying coffee. No one laughed this time. No one looked away. The room remained perfectly still, as every executive silently realized that the woman they had dismissed as invisible had seen what all of them, despite their experience, prestige, and expensive degrees, had completely overlooked. Richard Sterling left the boardroom without waiting for anyone to follow. The polished hallway that had always echoed with hurried footsteps now felt unusually quiet, each step carrying more weight than the last. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the late afternoon sun washed the executive floor in warm amber light, softening the sharp lines of marble walls and brushed steel. He passed assistants who instinctively stepped aside, but for the first time in years he barely noticed them. His attention was fixed on one destination. Downstairs, Maya Brooks had returned to work as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She carefully wiped fingerprints from the glass doors outside the executive elevators before collecting an empty recycling bin left beside the reception desk. Her movements were unhurried, the same steady rhythm she followed every day. She had already accepted that speaking up might cost her this job, and she had made peace with that possibility before leaving the conference room. Integrity had never depended on someone else's approval. The soft sound of approaching footsteps caused her to look up. Richard stopped several feet away, still dressed in the same tailored suit, but somehow appearing far less distant than the man who had dismissed her earlier that afternoon. Nearby receptionists quietly paused their work. Security officers glanced toward the unexpected meeting. Even employees waiting for the elevator sensed something unusual unfolding. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Richard finally broke the silence. "Miss Brooks," he said, his voice calm and sincere, "I owe you an apology." The words seemed to hang in the quiet lobby. They were simple, yet no one present could remember hearing the company's founder speak that way to a member of the housekeeping staff. Richard continued without looking away. "I judged your uniform before I listened to your words. That mistake nearly cost this company everything we have spent decades building." Maya lowered the cleaning cloth resting in her hands. She did not smile with satisfaction, nor did she allow pride to enter her expression. "You protected your company by checking the facts, sir," she answered gently. "Anyone willing to look for the truth deserves credit for finding it." Richard slowly shook his head. "No, you protected it first. I almost ignored the only person who was brave enough to speak when everyone else stayed comfortable." The lobby remained silent except for the distant chime of an arriving elevator. Warm sunlight reflected across the polished floor between them. Richard reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a business card bearing only his direct office number. He held it toward Maya. "Tomorrow morning I would like you to meet with me and our board. Not as a member of housekeeping. As someone whose judgment I want this company to hear." Maya looked at the card for a moment before accepting it with both hands. "Thank you, sir." Richard offered a faint smile. "There is one more thing." He glanced around at the employees quietly watching from nearby desks and hallways. "I should have remembered that wisdom does not come with a job title. It comes from character, discipline, and the courage to do what is right, even when no one expects you to speak." Maya nodded softly. "My mother always told me that respect is not something we earn after people believe us. It is something we choose to give before we know who they are." Richard stood silently for a moment, letting those words settle more deeply than any corporate presentation ever had. In that quiet lobby, surrounded by ordinary people finishing an ordinary workday, the distance between a billionaire and a maid disappeared, replaced by something far more valuable than authority. It was mutual respect. 3 months later, the executive floor of Sterling Tower looked almost exactly the same, yet everything important had changed. The marble still reflected the morning sunlight pouring through the glass walls. The elevators still opened with the same soft chime. Employees still hurried through the lobby carrying laptops, coffee cups, and meeting notes. But the atmosphere felt different, quieter in a way that could not be measured on a financial report. Richard Sterling had introduced a new policy requiring that every major decision include open review from employees across departments whenever specialized knowledge or first-hand experience could improve the outcome. It had surprised investors at first, but the company's culture gradually shifted. People who had once remained silent began sharing ideas with confidence, and departments that had rarely spoken to one another started solving problems together. Sterling Dynamics became known not only for innovation, but also for listening. Maya Brooks no longer entered through the service entrance before sunrise. She still arrived early, still carried the same worn leather backpack, and still greeted every security officer and receptionist by name. But now she stepped onto the executive floor, wearing a simple navy business suit instead of a gray housekeeping uniform. The legal textbooks that had once lived quietly inside her basement locker now rested on the shelves of a bright office overlooking the same Charlotte skyline she had admired while polishing conference room windows. A small nameplate beside her door read, "Maya Brooks, Corporate Risk Advisor." She had accepted the position only after finishing her law degree through an evening completion program funded by the company's new education initiative, a program Richard insisted should also be available to every employee who wanted to continue learning. Maya never asked for special treatment. She only requested that opportunity become available to everyone else who had been overlooked. Richard agreed without hesitation. On one quiet autumn morning, Maya walked past the conference room where everything had changed. Through the glass walls, she saw a group of young interns presenting ideas, while senior executives listened carefully instead of interrupting. Richard stood near the back of the room rather than at the head of the table. He noticed Maya passing by and stepped into the hallway. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply looked through the glass together as the discussion continued inside. Richard smiled softly. "Sometimes I still think about that afternoon," he admitted. "Not because of the contract. Because I almost walked away from the truth simply because I believed it had arrived wearing the wrong uniform." Maya looked toward the sunlight stretching across the polished floor. "People rarely remember the words that changed their lives," she said quietly. "They remember the moment they finally decided to listen." Richard nodded. There was nothing left to add. Maya continued walking down the hallway at her familiar, unhurried pace. Employees smiled as they passed her, not because of her title, but because of the kindness she had shown long before anyone knew her name. The warm morning light followed her reflection across the marble floor until it disappeared around the corner. Richard remained where he was for another moment, hands resting quietly at his sides, watching the empty hallway with genuine gratitude. The building itself had not changed. The glass still caught the sunrise. The elevators still rose toward the upper floors. The city beyond the windows continued its endless rhythm. Yet somewhere inside that quiet morning lived a lesson no contract could ever capture. True, strength had never belonged to the loudest voice, the richest person, or the highest office. It had always belonged to the one who chose honesty over comfort, courage over silence, and respect over judgment. And in the stillness that followed, the silence no longer belonged to pride. It belonged to justice.